Now, development. What goes on with development? Here, this slide right here doesn't necessarily mean there's no activation in the left, or no development going on in the left hemisphere during the first year of life. This is a relative measure. So early on, when a child is developing a lot of the kind of the feel for whether or not there's safety and love and everything and bonding, there's a heck of a lot of development going on in the right hemisphere. Right hemisphere, by the way, as you all know, deals with novelty. Left hemisphere deals with learned material, specific learned material. So look at this boom in left hemisphere development around the period, so-called sensitive period, used to be called critical period, of language development. Anyway, you see this scalloped kind of development here. You have a differing developmental kind of push, depending on what the child is experiencing. You all know about myelination. Myelination follows development in those so-called sensitive periods, and the areas of the prefrontal cortex, specifically the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is the last to myelinate. Some people say out into age 25. Think of it. The executive brain, remember the dorsolateral, dorsal fin up there, working memory and all that, last to myelinate and first to be lost. Wow. So, you know, you forget where your keys are. You're walking around, your age, whatever, 72 or something like that, and you're like, what was I doing in here? I walked in this room for some reason. Well, I'm doing it now, and I'm not that old. That's the first to be lost. Well, myelination, of course, is that fatty substance that acts as a conductor for a neuron so they fire more efficiently. And that really is a major part of development, as is apoptosis, programmed cell loss, which is so important, and many people don't really appreciate how critical it is to actually sculpt the brain as the brain develops. Meaning basically that you're pruning unused synaptic connections. And one of the theories related to autism is they proliferate neurons, synaptic connections, but don't prune down at that critical sensitive period back around age 2. So that lack of pruning results in them being overstimulated by social interaction, can't see and look at another person without feeling somewhat anxious. Let's talk about enriched and deprived environments. The Romanian babies have been kind of the province for a huge amount of research internationally in, for example, Canada and the United States and Britain. What people are finding as a result of babies adopted from Romania. Now you remember when Ceausescu collapsed in Romania, researchers went in and found these huge orphanages with these babies just sitting there languishing in their cribs. And they weren't really socially stimulated very much. Sure, they got plenty of food and everything, but the longer that they stayed in those cribs, the more self-stimulation they were evidenced, hand flapping and all that. And when adopted, failed to thrive, depending on how long they stayed in that orphanage. So Rutter, for example, in England, who took a look at the British adoptees, or the Romanian babies adopted by British families, found that, well, if they were in there past age 1, in there for a couple years, the chances of neurodevelopmental deficits were incredibly high. Whereas kids that were in there for just 6 months, less impairment was seen because that new attachment relationship superseded whatever deficits they might have had. So period of time of neuroplasticity during that sensitive period was so important. So missing that human contact impaired, as the neuroscientists discovered, areas of their orbital frontal cortex. So important in the capacity to form human relationships and modulate affect. Whereas enriched environments were looked at from a number of different vantage points. early on, we're still big on looking at rats and how their brains change with stimulation in rich environments. Well, it was pretty clear that rats that were stimulated a whole lot early on had denser brains, learned better, had better miracle-grow in their hippocampi areas, had better hippocampi. Gender differences, I didn't mention bilateral blood flow. That corresponds to the whole idea that better inter-hemisphere communication, thicker corpus callosum, and so on. Well, now we get into this area of impairment. What happens with kids who are actually abused? What happens to their brains? Well, we know through a lot of studies through the 90s that various areas of the brain, people's brains, experience some neurochemical trauma when they experience really noxious experience. And Robert Sapolsky drew attention to the concept of too much cortisol in the brain shrinks neurons in the hippocampal area. That kind of was a big discovery. Interestingly, and we'll talk about this related to stress a little later because it's so important to get redundant about this, there is a opposite reaction with the amygdala. So here you have a relationship between the amygdala and the hippocampus quite different in terms of response to noxious and considerable stress. Not just stress. Stress isn't a bad thing in itself. It's how much and over what period of time. So as we age and as the prefrontal cortex matures through both myelination and pruning, how we sculpt the brain through our interactions with our adolescents to individuate also is muchly the province of the prefrontal cortex, the executive brain. Who I am, how I fit into the world, how I can differentiate from my parents and still feel whole as I modulate my affect. Wow, God, I can think of my adolescence as being kind of a period of angst and having to deal with, modulating my affect. So how we help them sculpt and prune is really very, very important. And if they don't do it properly, then we've got all sorts of problems. This particular slide I really liked, and it's the only movie we have on board here, and I've got to apologize because when I click here, what you can see is the pruning process develop. It's a very short thing, maybe 3 seconds. But imagine the blue area is increasing. If I hit that, then what you'd see, as if it's time-lapse photography, is a pruning process that develops over a period of time. So less synaptic connections increases efficiency. So as that adolescent develops and becomes more proficient in modulating his or her affect, dopamine gets more efficient. There's some researchers that are suggesting that in many ways dopamine systems, dopaminergic systems don't really get fully mature until late adolescence. Makes a lot of sense because the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is kind of like the governor of working memory, which is what we used to call short-term memory, really quite a dopaminergic system. So getting those dopamine systems mature is really important. Well, what happens if you add in drugs that affect the dopamine system? Amphetamines, for example, and you kind of exhaust those neurons, so to speak. I wonder what kind of atrophy you might have. Some researchers are trying to take a look at that those sudden surges of dopaminergic types of drugs during adolescence when those circuits are developing through myelination and pruning. Also, what happens with the dopaminergic drugs that we use for ADD and ADHD? Ritalin or the other ones like Adderall and all that, the more amphetamine related, all dopaminergic and to some degree norepinephrine related drugs. Deficits, for example, not only in growth, and that's been a big concern for some time, but also increases in anxiety and depression. That's kind of like a nutshell.